Hi everybody, Kim here from Sacred Elohim's Diamond Light and Pearl Ministries, and I'm getting ready for our first reading. I finally finished outlining the first two parts of our series, so I'm presenting the first part of that series tonight, Breathe, Making Room for Sabbath by Priscilla Shear. And this is just a content review before we start. The content is session 1. We will discuss the freedom of the Sabbath. That will be over a period of 2 or 3 weeks. The second session will be stopping along the Sabbath journey. The next session will be double portion Friday. Haha. Session 4, the coming into focus section. And then session 5, which if you've got any questions, I'll cat my email at the end of it after the 12-week session is over. I plan around 11 to 12 weeks to have this done. I'm going to do it just day by day and post my day by day instead of doing it on Saturdays. That way we get through it througher and you get more material in less time. So our first thing we're going to be doing is session 1, which we'll be going over for the first 7 days, will be freedom of the Sabbath. So I will be reading through that, through the highlighting of it, so you have some idea of what Priscilla is talking to. So our first part of freedom of the Sabbath starts Sabbath setup. So we're setting up our day of rest for God. And she gives a quote from Harriet Tubman. It says, the great incapator of thousands of enslaved in America is quoted as saying, I freed thousands of slaves. I could have freed thousands more if they had known they were slaves. If only they knew. Ooh, that was her comment. Whoa, Priscilla says. My eyes widened as I read this statement and realized in captions, slavery is often the outcome of ignorance or denial. Freedom hinges on recognition and acceptance of freedom. So I'm going to ask this question. How do we define our freedom in God? Or Yahuwah? Through his son. How do we define our freedom away from sin? And how do we define our freedom with a Sabbath? Think about it. Big idea. Recognition is the prerequisite for liberation. She says she was focused right here on being in our study. I was enslaved and didn't know it. Are we all enslaved and don't know it? I wonder. Bound by things I never even thought of as possibly taskmasters. Taskmasters. What's a taskmaster? In the time of Moses, a taskmaster was somebody that beat the slaves to make them do with their will. Well, what sort of things do we have in our life that are taskmasters? Yet they had begun to exert far too much control over her life. What do we have in our life that exerts too much control? That the Lord wants to get rid of. Okay. Fact that my flesh cringed at the thought of curbing my desires to buy this or eat that. So what kind of desires we have? Do we need that latest phone? Do we need the latest gadgetry or toy? Do we need the new car? Do we need the new TV? I wonder. Or do we need that donut? Okay. To spend time doing this and not that. Our time. Do we make time for Adonai, our Lord? Interesting. Should have been my first indicator that something was a war. My flesh has become enslaved to things it was meant to enjoy as blessings, not as bondage. So how could everyday life be a bondage? We all have bondages. Some alcoholism, others drugs, others fear. Fear's a big bondage. Others I'm not going to name them all, but we can come to a conclusion of what a bondage is. A captive unawareness is what a bondage is. That's the term that she uses. But I was ignoring the warning and just carried on. That's what she said. And the definition she gave, a captive unaware. Okay. I have discovered, still discovering, after studying, reading, thinking, praying about the Sabbath, on Sabbath here, beautiful biblical principles deliver freedom from a type of slavery I didn't realize existed in my life. So how does the Sabbath that God created, his day of rest, free us? How does a day of rest free us when we set time aside for him? Interesting question. I thought of the Sabbath as nothing more than a day, a once a week, first century observance, dripping with too many rules and regulations to count, much less to observe. I discontinued its relevance for me. Sabbath was so Old Testament, old-fashioned, old school. Okay, so do most of us Christians think that way right now, that the Sabbath is old-fashioned? I don't, and I just learned it. What about you? What have you been taught? That the Sabbath is old-fashioned, it's Old Testament. I wonder. Little did she know, putting back the layers of the Bible, biblical themes would shine a bright spotlight onto something always meant to be so much more than just a rigid rule to follow. Even when it was first established in Israel for the people who knew nothing of slavery, God always and eternally intended the Sabbath to be a lifestyle. So when he says honor his Sabbath, he was determining that it be a lifestyle for us to follow as followers. An attitude, a perspective, an orientation of living that enables us to govern our lives and steer clear of bondage. Now, here's some examples of bondages. Bondages we are least likely to recognize. Things to do. To people, to hobbies, to indulgences, to work. These are just examples that she gives. I could go on, but somehow I feel like you can probably fill in the blanks yourself. In fact, before we even really get started, I think you should. So just sit down and fill those blanks in on a piece of paper. Because the question she poses, below, write the things, people, interests, and endeavors that might hold too much control over your right now in this session of your life. To what and whom do you find difficult to say no? I have my difficulties. Everyone does. And then she also has a rating, which I'm not going to go through that. Together, you and I are going to find out how the Sabbath principle keeps these things from bossing us around, controlling our lives, and becoming masters over us. Interesting. Sabbath margin is the boundary Yahuwah intended for us to place around the things we enjoy, so that we will never be a slave to anyone or anything other than him. He paid far too much high a price for us to share our allegiance with any other. She's talking about Jesus. She gives John 8:3. And Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Okay. Freedom from slavery begins with knowing. So let's get into it, shall we? And I'm going to stop here with this session. As far as that goes, where she's talking about the Sabbath. So next week, here's what we'll be doing. The setup for the Sabbath, we've already talked about. Week 1, or day 1, we will talk, and he rested. This is talking about Genesis, the week's big idea. Is the Sabbath principle is the key to freedom. The word Sabbath first appears in the scriptures during the Exodus from Egypt, but that was not the first time the concept was mentioned. Take note in Genesis 2. But the seventh day God completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the Sabbath, the seventh day, from all his work he had done, and that was Genesis 2:2. Obviously, God had a Sabbath in mind from the very beginning. Abraham Joshua Haskell, a 20th century Jewish rabbi and an author, wrote something I find profound about the Genesis 2 passage in his book, The Sabbath, its meaning for modern man. Read the following excerpt slowly and pay close attention to the portion I have highlighted. Note the words Mahua, which means rest in Hebrew. The word on the seventh day God finished his work, Genesis 2:2, seemed to be puzzling. We would surely expect the Bible to tell us that on the sixth day God finished his work. Obviously, the ancient rabbis concluded there was an act of creation on the seventh day. Just as the heaven and earth were created in the 6 days, Mahua was created on Shabbat, or the Sabbath. Mahua means rest. After the 6 days of creation, what did the universe still lack? Mahua. Menua, excuse me. The words menua came from the Sabbath. Came menua, and the universe was complete. Before we continue, Rabbi Haskell stated, take a moment to reread the highlighted proportions of the quote. Take your time, I'll wait. She says, on the seventh day, God finished. And then at an act of creation on the seventh day, Manua was created on Sabbath. That's rest. Rest was created. Manua came the Sabbath. Name Manua, and the universe was complete. Okay. Haskell continues, Manua, which we usually render with rest, means here much more than withdrawal from labor and exertion, more than freedom from toil, strain, or activity of any kind. Manua is not a negative concept, but something real and intrinsically positive. So it's a positive. Resting is a positive for us. It took a special act of creation to bring it into being. The universe would be incomplete without it. What was created on the seventh day? Tranquility, serenity, peace, and response. And she gives the acronym slowly. Drink it in. Think. So rest here was much more than just withdrawal from labor or exertion. It was a real positive intrinsic value. Okay, it was a special act of creation of bringing it into being. That the universe would be incomplete without it. Without rest, we're incomplete. It involves tranquility, serenity, peace, and repose. I'm so intrigued by this. The purpose of God's Sabbath was not to put up his proverbial feet, take a load off, and chill out after creating the universe in the previous days. He was not doing just nothing. Far from it. He was creating something. Rest. He created rest. The rest of the soul. Rest was a capstone of creation, and without it, the universe would be incomplete. So I'm going to leave you there with the thought of the notes, and we will pick back up the next week on that. The rest of it, she's just asking questions about Haskell. We will pick up on page 18, where she talks about other things dealing with the Sabbath. So, I'm not going to go over that. We will talk about Brad Lumsden and other theological translations tomorrow. So, that ends our study for tonight on Breathe. And please pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and I'll pray for you in my prayers of intercessory. Shalom and Salah.